allow me. When we talk about estate planning, can you give us a big picture? What is it and what are the challenges there?
Yeah, estate planning, when you break it down, it's really about helping people protect their family. And at least in America, if someone passes away without an estate plan, the laws in every state are very different. And many times, if you don't have a plan, the state actually gets to decide how your assets are distributed. And then you have to go through a process that's called probate, which essentially allows anyone to make claims against your assets. And it can be a quite expensive and drawn out process. And so most people should want to have a good, solid estate plan, if for no other reason to avoid having someone else decide how their assets are distributed and ensuring that their assets are distributed efficiently. Because even if they do go to their intended heirs, if you go through a probate process, many times that can take sometimes years to litigate. And so your heirs, while grieving, also don't have access to your assets. So it can be quite, in some cases, quite catastrophic if they need those assets to continue to pay for their living expenses or to cover education or things like that. So highly recommended that all people have an estate plan. And I think one of the things we've learned is that process can be quite daunting and hard to navigate. And so Vanilla really focuses on how we can help financial advisors guide their clients through the process. And what clients tell us is that they really want their advisor to help them kind of navigate and quarterback, as opposed to historically advisors have referred clients to an estate attorney. And while attorneys can be helpful in preparing documents, they're not always the best kind of counsel in figuring out how your plan should work, what you actually want to do with your assets, and making sure you execute it the right way.
Okay, I'm already understanding quite a lot of things here. Yes, because indeed it's a legal document, but it's a financial and let's say lifestyle and far-reaching decision. So there seems to be a lot involved in this. And just to compare it to, my personal references, here that we say we have to do a will or something like that, and I haven't done one. I must do one. It's in my to-do list, but I don't know if I'm daunted or I never got into it. But I assume it's something. It's like a document. It's a one document that I put somewhere. Well, at least that's how I imagine it. So how what does it look like?
It's a really good question, and I think that's part of where people are confused, because many times they think about the estate plan as just the documents, and that's not really the case. And so the fact that you haven't done one, I mean, you're not alone. I think it's estimated about 70% of Americans don't have a current estate plan. Either they haven't done one ever, or the one they have completed is out of date. But an estate plan really involves, I would say, three key elements. First is around protecting your family. And there are two key ways that you want to protect your family with a good estate plan. First of all is understand what their liquidity needs are. And if you're the primary breadwinner, or even just a contributing breadwinner, and something happens to you and you're no longer able to provide that support for your family, either assets or life insurance do you have to help fill that gap? And most people don't actually understand how much life insurance or liquidity they need and have a good way to know if they're in good shape or not. So that would be job one. Second is making sure you're really in control of how your assets, and for most people, they're going to pass away much later in their life. It's really not just assets, it's your life's work, right? It's everything you've accomplished. It could include things you've acquired over time. It could be your values. It could be things that hold sentimental value. How do you want those to be passed on to heirs or with charities or causes you care about? So that's kind of the first bucket, is how do you protect with both insurance and then the estate documents, whether it be a will or a trust, is very clear and legally sound in ensuring efficient asset transfer. Then the second bucket that we talk to, or that clients really care about, is their legacy. Legacy is really a combination of both their values as well as how they want to create impact with the assets they've acquired over time. That can be distributions to immediate heirs. It could be creating a trust for future generations. It could be creating a trust for charity. Lots of different ways that you can create impact. What's most important there is being really clear on what your intentions are to both your trustees and your family members. Most of the arguments and the fights and the strife that families deal with is when there's disagreement over what the intentions of the deceased were. And it can be little things like, did they want to be buried somewhere or do they want to be cremated, all the way up to not having alignment on how they wanted certain assets to transfer and who they were going to transfer to. And that many times can create fights. I personally lost both of my parents when I was in my mid 40s within a year of each other. This lack of clarity around my mom's intentions ultimately created a fight that caused my siblings to not talk to each other for about 3 years. And it wasn't about a lot of money. It was just this emotional attachment to what they believed very strongly in my mother wanted. And they just had a disagreement. And if my mom would have had a very simple letter of wishes that spelled out what her intentions were, that could have been completely avoided and likely would have, enabled us to come together at a time when we were dealing with a loss instead of getting in a fight. So it's actually really important. And then the third element of any good estate plan is being tax efficient. We have a number of different taxes that come into play. You have a federal estate tax, which is a 40% tax on assets above a certain level. Now, the good news is today the federal estate tax exemption is almost $14 million per person. So you have a very small portion of families that are actually subject to that federal estate tax today. But we also have state level estate taxes and then state level inheritance taxes. And there's some intricacies in how those work. But the most important thing to recognize is that many of the state level estate taxes have much lower asset thresholds. So for example, I'm a resident of the state of Washington, and they just recently made a change to their law where after $3 million exemptions, that means for the first $3 million of assets that you've acquired, there's no tax. And then after that, they want to tax at a 35% rate. Seattle is a fairly expensive place. And so pretty almost anybody that owns a home and maybe has a retirement account is likely going to exhaust that $3 million exemption and be subject to a 35% estate tax if they don't plan appropriately. Which basically anything you want to give to your heirs, the state of Washington is going to take 35% off the top before anything gets transferred. So it can be quite expensive. So planning for those contingencies and avoiding those taxes is a big part of what clients look to their financial advisors to help them do.
Yes, you paint quite a picture here, and I understand better. Well, yes, the difficulty of doing that, right? Because you've got the assets, you've got the sentimentality, you've got what you want to make it in the best possible, the most efficient way, because you'll think about tax and stuff like that and other stuff. So I can now understand, okay, how it all comes together into this estate planning and how complicated it must be. I look at it from an individual, but then, okay, now we've got to talk about how tech and people can help into that. So this is where we can understand where vanilla comes and, what role do you play in that ecosystem?
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple points of reference. One is that most folks that have financial advisors, in fact, 92% of folks that have financial advisors would like their advisor to help lead them and guide them through the estate planning process. They view that as a core service that they actually engage an advisor to help them do. Yet today, only 23% of clients are getting that service from advisors. And so there's a big gap between what clients would like to have and what they're actually getting from advisors. And part of the reason why advisors don't provide that service is historically estate planning has been incredibly artisan. So there's been not a lot of technology. It's quite confusing and complicated. And so most advisors didn't feel like they were qualified or had the tools to appropriately support their clients. And that's where Vanilla comes in. And Vanilla was actually founded by Steve Lokshin. Steve is a 35 plus year wealth advisor, built and sold multiple advisory firms, and really over the last 20 years built his practice starting with estate planning. And his clients are mostly all ultra high net worth individuals where they're they're having to deal with both federal estate tax as well as the state level estate and inheritance taxes. And so from an advisor perspective, when you can help a client appropriately plan and avoid that 40% tax, you've essentially created a 40% return for them without having to change their risk profile. And so it's really a great deal. And I think the ROI for the client investing in that advisor to achieve that savings is incredibly high and immediate. And so as Steve built out his practice, the thing that he realized though was that it required a tremendous amount of manual effort and deep knowledge for an average advisor to be able to support the client through that estate planning process. And so he founded Vanilla actually in 2019 with the idea of building technology to support his team that was struggling to be able to just scale for clients, being able to really provide the information that they needed to understand where their current plan was and where the opportunities were to improve it. And because it was all manual, there were no software tools, there was no system of record for estate planning. So his original idea for Vanilla was, how do I actually make this easier and more repeatable and empower advisors to better serve their clients? And as he went out and started talking to others in the industry, he realized it wasn't just his firm that had this opportunity. There was a broad need to have better tools. And so in 2021, he decided to go raise some money and really start building in earnest. And that's when I joined the firm. And so essentially what Vanilla was designed to do was really to provide that system of record, provide a single source of truth for a client's family information, so their entire family tree and how their family is structured. And we support up to 5 generations in a visual diagram of a family tree to support whatever estate planning they have done. So if they've created trusts or wills, to be able to represent visually what those trusts look like. And then the important third component is to represent the entire value of their estate through a balance sheet. And that balance sheet is structured in such a way that you can see how individual assets are actually titled. So are they owned by individuals? Are they owned by a trust? Are they inside the estate or are they outside the estate? Because that impacts whether they're subject to taxes. And bringing together those 3 pieces of information helps a client and the advisor pretty quickly understand what planning has been done so far. As a result of this planning, what happens when the first client, typically you'll have a couple, and the way that tax laws work, there's impact at the first death and impact at the second death. And so helping that client understand what will happen at each of those events, how will their assets flow, what taxes will be owed, what will go to beneficiaries, and then most importantly, is that actually consistent with their goals? And if it's not, what are the changes we need to make to either optimize the asset transfer, make sure we don't create a fight in the family because we didn't think through how they would be transferred in the right way so that all the heirs understand, and avoid situations that maybe would create trouble down the road. For example, giving a large sum of money to a teenager or a young adult before they really have the judgment or life experience to deal with it is usually not a great idea. And so being able to understand all of those things and then figure out how do I make sure I have the right plan in place is really where Vanilla puts that advisor, empowers that advisor to be able to support the client that way. And the value for the advisor is that through the estate planning process, a couple of things happen. First, they probably will have the most intimate conversation they've ever had with a client because you're talking about their family and who they love. You're talking about their total wealth, not just the wealth that you're managing, and what their relationship is with money. How do they want to create impact? Do they want to pass it on to heirs? Do they want to give it to charity? How do they think about, not spoiling their kids? And then along the way, you also then start to understand their total asset picture. And when you demonstrate value in helping them think through and plan their entire estate, many times that leads to clients transferring more assets to the advisor to manage. So the advisor sees increased retention. They see typically an increase in assets under management. And then the final benefit is along the way, they likely will get to understand who the client's heirs are. And at some point even build a relationship with them as a help the client explain how their plan works. And today, when a primary client passes away, I think the number is something like 90% of the time the assets end up leaving the firm because the advisor doesn't know or have a relationship with the heirs who are inheriting those assets. So it's definitely in the advisor's best interest to figure out how to solve this gap for their clients.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you brought a lot of elements there. And I want to go to the advisor side soon. But first, just a remark, because this resonated so much with me with previous conversations, which were on totally different topics, but basically investment and data. And this point reference to the single point of truth and to manage to look at things holistically. It's something that we've applied to wealth management, to asset management, to big firms, small firms. And I think this is probably one of the biggest unlock for technology, or the biggest theme at the moment, because we have so many complex things. Here you give the example of estate planning, and it's a lifetime of work, asset, beliefs that come into that. So, how do you solve that? And the big unlock seems to be this technology. So it really resonates in many different ways. And now, just a remark, but you can maybe elaborate, but I also really want to go into this, how it really works with advisor. And I can see how strategically you're positioned to solve many of their challenges. You mentioned this discrepancy between people who wish they could discuss that and people who are able to do that. And you also mentioned this thing that I think can perfectly refer to this great wealth transfer and this anxiety, this opportunity and anxiety, right, for wealth managers that, is the first thing that's going to happen? Am I going to be fired? Or, is it a great opportunity to manage more wealth across generation? I'd like to understand a bit, financial advice. What type of firms are we considering for your particular segment? Is it any size and shape? Is it larger firms, and what do they look like?
I would say we see firms across the entire spectrum. So at one end, we have large wirehouses and asset management firms like Vanguard, for example, is a large customer of ours and also an investor. We see many mid-sized RIAs. So Mariner would be a good example of that. We see high-end specialty advisors that focus on the ultra high net worth who are adopting vanilla. And then we see all the way down to independent advisors that manage mass affluent clients, where the clients really just need help with creating their estate documents and ensuring they have life insurance, that are adopting vanilla. So it's a very broad spectrum across hundreds of firms. And it really boils down to a value offering for each of the client types. So for example, if you start at the lower end of the wealth spectrum with a mass affluent client that maybe has a retirement account, maybe some investment accounts that they have an advisor helping them with, for them, estate planning is really about ensuring they have sufficient life insurance in case something happens to them, ensuring they have their documents in place that will meet their needs, and they can do that all through vanilla. The advisor can invite them in to go and create their documents through vanilla. And then having a clear letter of wishes to their heirs that explains what their intentions are. Again, that can be done completely through vanilla. So the advisor can serve them end to end. As I start to move up the wealth spectrum, I might start to have a client that has state level estate tax or state level inheritance tax implications. And that's where the visualization and understanding the waterfall and what happens at the various life events, where death of the first spouse, death of the second, will actually impact either potential taxable events or other things. And part of that planning is, if you're a client in your, say, mid 40s or early 50s, and you're still in very much the wealth accumulation phase. So you might have an estate today that isn't taxable, have a small tax liability. But if you project out 30 years to your life expectancy, you may have a much bigger tax issue if you don't plan appropriately. And then certainly as you go further up the wealth spectrum, as you start to get into high net worth, ultra high net worth, many times you're dealing with business owners, corporate executives that have significant company equity, folks that have either inherited some wealth along the way, or maybe they started a company. And the reality is that for many of those folks in that situation, planning early has much more leverage than waiting until they already have accumulated or assets have appreciated to the point where they have a meaningful tax bill. So it really can address every spectrum or every level across the wealth spectrum. It's just what value looks like varies from focus primarily on protecting my family. As you get into that ultra high net worth, it's, can be potentially millions of dollars of potential taxes that they can avoid, which also benefits the family because it lets their life's work go to their heirs, not to the government.
Yeah, fascinating. So I want to get a bit more into the nitty gritty and the tech, but just also to fully understand, before vanilla, those wealth advisors, they were just not able to deal with that. I mean, in general, right? They would say, "Hey, go to an attorney,
Yeah, well,
sort it out, and they'll come back to me."
My experience, I have a couple of different advisors, and one of my advisors asked me if I had an estate plan, and I said, "Well, I'd done a will before my first child was born, but it had been 10 years." And he said, "Well, here's the name of a good estate attorney here in Washington, and he'll hook you up." In his mind, he had provided me estate planning services. There was no, "This is what I recommend for your situation," or "I understand what your issues might be. Let me explain for you." None of that. It wasn't advice or life coaching. It was, "Here's an attorney. Good luck." And what I found was, and I've had so many other people tell me of a similar experience, is attorneys in general, for the most part, they're going to help you execute whatever it is that you want to go do. And they'll explain to you how the law works when you have questions about it. But they're not particularly great at least most that I've run into and most of people tell me about, they're not particularly great at making a strong recommendation and say, "Hey, based on your situation, this is what I think you should do. And here's why." And so my experience with the attorney was very much "Oh, you need an estate plan? Great. Well, typical estate plan has these components. What do you think?" I said, "Great, let's go with that." And then I came back later and learned that I should have done some things differently based on my financial situation and my tax situation. And when I asked my attorney about it, it says, "Oh, we could do that too. You just need to tell me what you want to do." And I'm like, "Well, that's not, it's the blind leading the blind."
Yeah, we're missing the holistic approach, and there's different skill sets involved into that. So obviously, it's a tricky one. So can we now go into the nitty gritty? So how does it work? How do people, let's say, start using your solution? Is it software as a service?
Yeah. Vanilla is a software as a service platform. The subscription is sold to the advisor. And when they buy a license, they're able to use the platform with all of their clients. There are multiple components of the platform. I talked about bringing together all of that information. Part of how we do that is we integrate with some of the systems that advisors already use. So if they're using Salesforce to manage all of their client data, we have an integration that will let them pull all that client information into Vanilla to create profiles for each client in Vanilla. We have integrations with some of the performance management systems like eMoney and Addepar, Black Diamond, and Orion, where you can pull in all their balance sheet and financial information. We have invested pretty heavily in AI. So if the client has estate planning documents, they can upload those documents. The AI will read and pull out all the key provisions and create all the visuals of how their estate plan actually works. And then there's still some additional discovery that has to happen on the part of the advisor to understand what assets does the client have that aren't currently being managed by their firm. So, do they have real estate, other private investments, or high value assets like, say, art or coins that they're not aware of? And that's really where you start to get that complete picture, but also where you start to have kind of a different type of a conversation with the client. Because most of the time, advisors that aren't thinking about estate planning are probably having a lot of conversations with their clients around how did we perform against the index and what was our return this quarter. It's all very much on the investment side. And this is pivoting to start to say, okay, let's think about how we protect your family over the long term. And to do that, we need to do proper planning. And to do proper planning, we have to understand your entire net worth. And not from the perspective of, I'm trying to sell you something or I'm trying to get you to move more assets. This is really from the perspective of, how do I help you protect your family? What our advisors report is that conversation really resonates with clients, and they want to have it, they want the help. And so they're much more open about being willing to share that total financial picture. And so once they have that information, the advisor then can input that in vanilla, or we have a way for them to share a survey with the client for the client to upload that directly. They can even link other investment accounts or bank accounts through a Plaid integration that we have. And that's really where all the data kind of comes together in that one central location for estate planning. And that's where it gets powerful, because once you have all the data, you can then perform analysis, projections, and start to look at what if scenarios around, okay, here's where we are today. Now, here's a few recommendations on ways we can improve the plan. That's also where our AI comes in, because we start to proactively provide recommendations to the advisor based on the information that's in the system today. Here's a few opportunities we think you should explore with the client. So we really try and both educate the advisor and give them the tools to be able to have those conversations with confidence, as opposed to feeling like, I don't really understand this, I don't want to look dumb in front of my client, and so I'm not going to have the conversation.
Yeah, this also reminds me of another conversation, which I often refer to. That's from Alok Yadvani, who's an investor at Fidelity. God, I never remember the name of the firm, FISV Fidelity. Anyway, I'm just going to say Alok Yadvani, who said the advice model is still a bit broken, probably will be for a long time. It will not be perfectly fixed, but there's this core challenge of having a holistic view of having the assets and the liabilities of the client. And now that I talk to you, Gene, I realize that this asset and liability, in the long term, well, it doesn't end, well, it never ends, right? So therefore, a state kind of comes very naturally. Can you also tell us, so now from the perspective of the advisor, is it like a toolbox? Is it kind of an end-to-end thing that they can maybe share with the client? How does it work in terms of their relationship?
Yeah, so we provide a bunch of educational materials. They can actually earn CE credits by going through some of our training materials to learn about the concepts of estate planning and get more comfortable being able to explain things to their end clients. We then provide a number of client-facing materials that they can share with their clients to help them understand why it's important to actually do estate planning and what the process looks like and how the advisor can help them. So we create the right environment where the advisor has context and the client has context to actually then engage in the process. And then we include coaching guides on how to have those first conversations. We have a tool called the Estate Health Check, which is a very simple survey that the advisor can send to the client. The client will answer some questions about their net worth, the amount of life insurance they have, their annual expenses, what planning they've done. And that will give the advisor a good sense of where is that client in the estate planning journey and what are some likely next steps that they should do. So Vanilla essentially starts by giving you all the tools to get started and the context and the education. Then it gives you the actual engagement tools to go talk to the client, start to engage in the conversation and figure out where they are. And then once you know where they are, it'll give you recommended actions on how to help them move to the next step and ultimately get to a well-designed plan that has been, they actually implemented it and they're in a good spot. They can create their documents through Vanilla, or we have an attorney network where they can go and where we have transparent pricing. The advisor can be involved with the attorney and the client so that they can continue to play that quarterback role. We give them all the resources they need to manage it end to end.
Fascinating. And if we go and then zoom in even more, go inside, I'm interested in the tech and what it's built. And I've already understood that there's a lot of integrations there from platforms like Salesforce, eMoney. Can you give us kind of a timeline of how this has been built on your side?
Well, so it's a platform. We're built on top of AWS, and we think of it as a system of record for estate planning. So you talked about the integrations and all this data that goes into it. On the back end, we have this, the big database that's able to hold all them information and analyze the context of it. We then have components of the software that are designed for advisors. And I talked about a little bit where the these tools to help engage clients. You can show them sample profiles so they have an understanding of what the output would look like if they engage in the process using vanilla. But then we also have planner tools. Many firms have in-house planning teams with specialists in estate planning will want to be able to run more complicated scenarios, particularly for taxable clients, to model different strategies to try and minimize their estate tax and actually be able to compare those what-if scenarios to the current baseline so they can show the client the impact or the savings. And so we have all of those tools, from something to help an advisor that just needs to have that simple conversation all the way up to a planner that's going to have a fairly in-depth conversation on how to move assets out of the estate to avoid that 40% federal estate tax liability.
And as we talk about what you're building, I think the history, or at least the fundraising of the company, is a point of interest. You mentioned Vanguard, which to me is something very important, but there's another investor that people talk about. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So Steve raised the original Series A back in 2021, and that was led by Venrock, which is one of the oldest venture firms. It used to be part of the Rockefeller family office. They're based in New York. As part of that original Series A, Vanguard came on as an initial investor as well. And then we raised an initial Series B in 2022, led by Insight Partners. Along the way in both of those rounds, we had a number of senior folks at large RIAs and investment firms who Steve's known for years that also invested along the way. And then we had a follow-on to our Series B last year. And there we added Edward Jones, we added Nationwide Ventures and Allianz, and had follow-on investments from Vanguard as well. So we've got a number of strategic firms that have invested just because they believe in the space, and most of those firms are now customers. We've raised just over $80 million total since our founding.
But sorry, wasn't there Michael?
Oh, yes. Michael Jordan is one of Steve's clients, and Michael Jordan also invested in the Series A.
That's what I was getting at. Right. Okay, fantastic. Now, this is really interesting. And I need to ask about your background, but also about how you go through market and stuff like that. Let's start with that, perhaps, because you seem to have a very compelling offer, and you've expressed the gap. It seems like quite obvious. But what are the challenges to reach that audience, or how do you approach marketing?
Great question. I would say a couple of things that we've seen and learned. First of all, there's a very compelling need for this, but it's a pretty big change for advisors. I mean, we're creating a new category of software because until vanilla, there really was nothing in the kind of estate advisory space, if you will. And so anytime you're creating a new category, it takes time for the customer base to, first even understand that there's a new category and then understand why they need it and then make the decision to buy. What we've seen is that there's a building sense of demand, but we continue to see a lot of advisors that will come and kick the tires and say, well, I'm not ready yet, or I want to wait till it's a little farther along. We think that the total size of this market is huge. The total addressable market for advisors is probably $7 to $8 billion a year in annual spend. Yet today, a small fraction of that is actually buying because it's just early. So I think you're going to see tailwinds as the category gains broader adoption and more advisors feel more comfortable because, as you know, their advisors have a lot coming at them with investments and changes in technology and robo and everything else. And so this is just one more thing for them to have to think through and figure out where it fits into their practice. So I'd say that's the first thing. A lot of our marketing is really around helping advisors understand why they should be in this business and how the tool will make it easier so it overcomes that kind of resistance to dive in and do something new. And then second is showing them how easy it is to get started and to learn and get confidence that they can be successful with estate planning. And so we do a lot of webinars. We do a lot of work with our training programs and helping them get CE credits. We share a lot of the best practices. We recently published a case study where Mariner tracked the portfolio growth of advisors that were using estate planning and kind of what they call their modern advisory platform that includes vanilla versus advisors that hadn't yet adopted it. And so we have tangible evidence that you can grow your business faster leveraging estate advisory. We had another firm that documented they'd grown their asset base by about 1.6 billion they could attribute that just to doing estate planning with vanilla. As they did estate plans for clients decided to move more assets under management. So it's very tangible, but it just, change takes time. And particularly in the wealth advisory space, people can tend to be a little slow to adopt. And then once it reaches a tipping point, then everybody wants to be in.
Yeah, it seems like typically the kind of thing when I hear you, it's like, oh, of course they need it. Of course everybody should have it, but do they want it? And it's a whole different, the gap can be huge. So yes, very interesting. Also interesting, this, education as a marketing tool with the credits and stuff. But I think before we're almost running out of time. So I think before we finish, we also need to at least understand the question that normally people start with a podcast, but I'll finish with that in terms of your journey and how you got there, because I mentioned you're the president and CEO, but you said the founder is someone else. So that's one part. And then I think the origins, because you started at Coca-Cola.
Atypical. Not a lot of folks have been on the journey I've been on. So I actually grew up in Seattle, or a suburb of Seattle, Washington, and went to college at the University of Washington. I got a degree in business. And at the time, I got actually recruited on campus and went to work for the Coca-Cola company in a sales role. And I spent my first 18 years of my career at Coke in various sales and marketing roles. Along the way, went back and got an MBA at Emory University in Atlanta, and had an opportunity. The last role I had at Coca-Cola, I actually had an opportunity to lead an internal startup that built the Coca-Cola Freestyle machine. So if you've ever been to a Five Guys or a AMC Theaters or
okay, that's the Coca-Cola Freestyle. Yes, Five Guys, all the different options at your fingertips.
So I led a team that built that from startup to fully commercializing it. It was about a 6-year journey, and it was fascinating. But what it taught me about myself was that my calling was really building products and companies. And I just had so much fun doing that. I just had this passion for it. And so I realized that doing more of that was going to be hard to do at Coca-Cola. And so in 2012, I left Coca-Cola and joined Amazon Web Services back before most people knew what cloud computing was. And so I spent 5 years at AWS working in the enterprise software space, building solutions for enterprise software. And I built products like Amazon Workspaces and Amazon Chime. And it was an amazing experience. I loved Amazon as a company, but I kind of still had this itch to do something more entrepreneurial. And so in 2017, I left Amazon to join a little company in Bellevue, Washington called Smartsheet. And at the time, Smartsheet was about 80 million in revenue, but growing very, very quickly. And they're in the collaborative work management space. And so I joined as a chief product officer. And over the course of 4.5 years, we grew Smartsheet from 80 million to over 620 million in revenue. And since I've left, they've grown to over $1 billion. And as head of product and strategy, I got to be one of the kind of architects, part of the team that actually drove that growth, and learned a ton along the way, but gave me the passion to say, I really want to lead a company on my own. And so I started looking around a little bit, and Steve was actually recruiting, because while Steve is an amazing financial advisor and he's great at taking ideas from 0 to 1, he would tell you, and our investors agreed, he doesn't really know a lot about building a software company. We actually call it the dynamic duo, right? Steve brings his depth of wealth management and product experience and client experience, and he's built multiple RIA firms. I bring the experience building technology from the ground up across multiple companies. I think those two skill sets combined let us iterate really, really quickly, build enterprise-grade solutions, and serve our customers broadly. And so it's been a good combination. We've enjoyed really nice growth. Since we started selling 2.5 years ago, we've almost doubled every year, and I think the future's bright.
Yeah, and it's very, I go back to the same Jay story, but there's so much more to it. But, I think it's also fascinating how investors or let's say financial advisors might not have the skills, but they're very well positioned to tap into a network of people, of investors and stuff like that. And that also shows you the trust that there is, when someone who's your client become your investor. I just pick on this one particular one because I had to. But what a story, and what a fantastic career. I think we're going to end on this because that's quite a highlight. I'm really grateful for your time. Do you want to add something? I mean, we'll put all the links, but if there's any particular way that people can reach out to you.
Our website is justvanilla.com, and we'd love to hear from you. It's really easy to sign up and have a demo. I think it's an emerging trend. So if you're trying to build a business and you really want to build deep client loyalty, you should check out estate planning.
Yeah, and it's just vanilla in one word. I'd be checking the website. and I had a look. It's really, there's so much resources there, and it's quite fascinating to see how it works. I see a lot of companies in this Series B space where they typically work on the website and develop new iteration. I can see this is an iteration. I mean, something that we work on all the time. And this has been a fascinating chat, Gene. I thank you so much for your insights. If you want to find out more about what's been discussed in this podcast, you will find more resources in the descriptions. If you want to explore further this particular area of wealth tech, I recommend a previous episode that I will also link there. And the best way to keep updated and get notified of every new discussion where we explore how to create better outcomes for investors with the help of technology is by subscribing, and you can do this on your podcast app, on YouTube, or via the newsletter. Thank you. Until next time.